Hi, I'm Vincent, and I'm a composer based in Los Angeles. I'm here today to answer your music composition questions on Reddit. This is RUBICON on Reddit. Essay 97 asks, how does one get started with orchestral composition? I view orchestration and composition as two separate disciplines. I mean, they're very strongly connected, of course, but whenever I write a piece of music, I will usually start by creating a piano sketch. Because piano is my first instrument, I'll sort of write the piece on the piano. And then once the piece is written, I orchestrate it, or I arrange it for orchestra, which means I distribute segments of the music to different players throughout the orchestral lineup. One more time. I'll cue you, yeah? Oh, good. 575. Compose something first, whichever way you like to compose. So write your piece of music, in other words, and then decide which bits of that music should go to which orchestral element. Joshua Lintag asks, help, arguing over which one is better, classical versus EDM. I'd say something that's very unique almost to classical music is the sort of ebb and flow of intensity and emotions, which I hear not as much in modern music. That being said, EDM is usually played in clubs where actually there is a longer form because the DJ creates it, right? The DJ creates a playlist, so to speak, out of several EDM pieces, which very much ebb and flow. Like that's the whole point of a DJ. So with all this being said, I'd say classical music and EDM serve entirely different purposes. EDM is primarily for dancing, I'd say, and classical music is, in most cases nowadays, less so. For sort of sitting down and appreciating and listening to it. So yeah, I don't know if you can really compare the two in a very sensible way. WHSLDOFTKH asks, name some generally unknown artists that people should listen to. Well, I mean, this is a very open-ended question. There's a million, but if I have to choose a few, definitely go with LA-based indie R&B artist Rubber, who does some really interesting stuff. I think he's working on a new album right now, which is, I hear is going to be very, very sick. Another one is Fresh Breakfast. There's some really interesting, unconventional types of rap. Floating Points is another one. They do classical music, but it's produced in a modern way. Yeah, endless. 443610. What is the best music track from a Netflix original that you have heard? Dark. Because the soundtrack for that is so sick. Really imaginative, but also works really well to support the drama of the series. So yeah, that's my answer. FilmGamer1 asks, what's the best musical score from a composer who has never been nominated for an Oscar? Okay, I'm gonna have to go with Cristobal Tapia de Veer. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who did the score for White Lotus, which if you've seen the show, you can probably agree that it's very unusual, but it also works with the film in a very interesting way. I feel like it really brings out this weirdness and this strange connection to nature or the natural spirit the show has, juxtaposing with these people who have come so far from being natural or living connected to the natural world. And it really merges these two elements in a great way, because he's taking very natural sounds, but is producing them in a very unusual and a very modern way. So I think that's an amazing score. Shoeri_bomb is asking, what's a piece or composer who made no sense to you? I don't know if you've ever heard about serialism. Not created necessarily, but the beacon of that genre is Arnold Schoenberg. He came up with a system known as the 12-tone system, which is meant to give equal weight to each note on the musical spectrum, rather than having some notes that are more important or that the music is sort of geared towards. And the system says each note cannot resound before all other 12 notes, of the piano have sounded. I think he meant well, and it's a very difficult thing to try and reinvent yourself given the existing formats. But I personally don't think it sounds very beautiful. Artie asks, Spotify or Apple Music? Apple Music, I think, pays artists twice as much as Spotify does. Most people seem to be on Spotify. I don't know why that is exactly. They seem to have some sort of monopoly on music consumers. Personally, I have to say, as awful as it sounds, I do use Spotify just because I've had it forever, and yeah, it's bad. I probably shouldn't. I should be using Amazon Music because they pay artists really a lot. Numerous Avocado 6170 asks, is it just me or is composing completely different than film scoring? Well, I wouldn't say it's completely different, but there is a very big difference between the two disciplines. Both are to do with writing music, of course, but the thing that's taken away from film scoring is the structure, or the way that structure is thought about. As a film composer, you're working to a piece of film that's sort of given to you and that has an existing structure, and you're then writing music that supports the structure, follows it, punctuates it. So you never once have to really create your own structure in that sense. I mean, you kind of do, but it's always mirroring the piece of film. Whereas if you're writing music that is just music, concept music, that's completely different because you have complete authority over how the structure of that piece should flow. Skylar_Schutz asks, how do music composers match their soundtrack composition so perfectly with movie scenes? So actually what I'd say most of modern film composers do is, especially ones that have to work to a tight schedule, is receive the film and have them in their what's called a DLW, so in their sort of music program. And so you can watch the film, sort of play along and see what works. And in your timeline, you can place sounds and record sounds in specific moments in the film. So you can see when a certain thing happens in the film and go, all right, that's when I want this thing to happen. And then this sort of like ebbs down. And you just go bit by bit. Usually people do some sort of sketch. Could be a piano sketch, it could be with any other instrument, and sort of do a very rough thing of how they want a certain scene to flow. And once they're happy with where each beat of the music lands, then they sort of fill it out and orchestrate the rest of the music and construct the soundtrack that way. PIHKAL21 asks, what would you say is the most beautiful orchestral piece? I'm going to have to go with Gustav Mahler's Fifth Symphony, Fourth Movement is gorgeous, hands down, no question about it. FreeEase4078 asks, what are musical notes? Most types of music, or most types of Western music at least, we think of the music having beats. 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Often in groups of 4, though you could group it however you would like. And musical notation measures where in this grid of beats a note falls and how high it is. So the x-axis, so to speak, shows you where the note lands, and the y-axis shows you how high the note is, right? And there are certain symbols. If a note falls on the beat, it's thought about as being a quarter note. If there's 2 notes per beat, that's eighth notes, and they're written slightly differently with stems. The lines that you see in music notation, they correlate to specific pitches. So the middle C is on the first ledger line below the set of lines, and so on and so forth. And that's how you notate music. RBDE Arman asks, has anyone tried using traditional music notation for creating electronic music? Yes, they absolutely have. One of the first people, I believe, to do this was probably Karlheinz Stockhausen, a German composer, who I think he probably would have done this in the sort of like 1950s. Don't quote me on that, but somewhere thereabouts. And he was sort of really pushing classical modern music at the time, and pushing the boundaries of what's possible. And he started composing with synthesizers and developed ways of notating that type of music. And it's actually quite simple. And the thing about notation is it really serves us rather than we serve notation. So notation is to really write down whatever you want, and you can stretch the boundaries of notation. There's this sort of typical notation that we've had for hundreds and hundreds of years, but now music's changed, so there are ways of notating it with lines and symbols. There's a whole movement of what's called graphic scores, where people sort of more or less freely draw sounds, and performers interpret these drawings freely. Most underscore time 8900 asks, why are musicians so Spotify centric? Well, I think Spotify has a monopoly on us. I don't really know the politics and economics of it too well, but it seems to be the status quo. When people release music, they ask listeners to go on Spotify and listen to it. Often there are people who are sort of rebelling against it because they notoriously pay artists very little. Landon Cook 5 asks, just wondering why entry-level jobs in LA are so hard to get. You could work for something like a publisher or a label, right, which is sort of more the admin side of things, or you could freelance, right? And then, of course, I guess there's freelancers who are quite successful. Big composers like Hans Zimmer, for example, employ other people. Hans Zimmer famously has a company called Bleeding Fingers. I don't know if they're still called Bleeding Fingers or if they changed their name. I'm not entirely sure, but a lot of big composers employ assistants or other composers to sort of ghostwrite for them or fill in the blanks of things they've written. The thing that's tricky is getting people to spend money on music. And when people do spend money on music, something for things like concert tickets or buying albums or buying merch, it's for artists that are probably quite well established or are gaining momentum. So anyone who is not yet quite established, it's quite difficult to break in, because you have to convince the audience that they should invest money in you, basically. Outer Space Duck is asking, creating music for a documentary without the video yet, any tips? I personally love writing music for film and not actually having the film yet, because it's quite free and you can just sort of like fuck around a little bit. But I try and think about, well, what the documentary is about, what emotion you really want the listener to feel. Who's the protagonist in the documentary, if there is one? How do we feel about the protagonist? What are the different emotions that protagonist goes through in the documentary? Maybe there's elements of happiness and elation. Maybe there's sort of deeper, darker moments that character goes through, and then imagine how that would sound, or which sound would support that part of the story arc, and writing a piece of music inspired by that. I actually composed a soundtrack for a German documentary. In that one, I didn't actually write the music before I got the picture. I got the picture, and the deadline was actually quite tight, so I was writing to the picture. Left Western 1057 asks how to make a song in the style of the national anthem. The melody of the US national anthem is actually quite unsingable. It's like it jumps all over the place. The things that jump out at me is the way the harmony flows is quite quickly. In other words, the harmonic rhythm, how quickly you move from chord to chord is quite quickly, sometimes one chord per note. So that's definitely one takeaway. The second takeaway is, well, I go about it by writing the melody first and then fitting the chords. And the type of chords that I used are all parts of the key that we're in. There's some secondary dominance in there, and there is definitely some seventh chords in there and some first inversion sixth chords. So using those to harmonize your melody is probably a good bet. And then in terms of orchestration, it's very brass heavy, brass woodwinds. I think there's some strings in there as well. Obviously, the marching snare is a must. And I think if you follow these tips, you're on a good way to writing the US national anthem. I mean, some national anthems that are quite cool. I do like the German one. Obviously, I was raised on that. French is quite cool. British national anthem. I mean, the thing that annoys me about national anthems is I think it's time to rewrite them. unpopular opinion, perhaps. Google184 asks, how the heck did they do the music for Tom and Jerry? The way they would, in most cases, do it is they would sort of come up with a sheet, the animation studio would, and write down which action happens at which point in time. It's like at 2 seconds, this happens at 4 seconds, that happens. I'm oversimplifying now, but that's the basic concept. And so then the composer had to write music to follow that arc. And then on the day of the recording, they would often have to conduct to the picture. Yeah, it's quite stressful. And there's instances of, the hits not lining up properly because there was a mistake in the layout of, the music sort of schedule. And it sounds, I'm getting heart palpitations just talking about it. DVIR971 asks, favorite track from Oppenheimer's soundtrack? Really like Can You Hear the Music? It's kind of a basic answer, but it is a great track. Great idea of Ludwig Göransson to, the way he constructed that with the speeding up of the tempo and those string runs. Really, really great. Reddit burner _5225 asks, what's the best sound design library subscription? I have no idea. All sound design effects that I have and use often are sort of from different libraries that I couldn't exactly tell you what they're called, but I've just sort of accumulated over the year. If you want to do it like really properly, try and do it yourself and try constructing sound design elements yourself. It can be quite time consuming, but you're going to end up with really original sounding sound effects. Kettle Bezzello asks, what microphone should I get? The way you ask this question makes me think that probably you're quite new to making music or performing music. A sort of very standard microphone that's not too expensive is the SM58, which is great for performing live, for live vocals. You can use it in the studio. People rarely do, but it's very robust. It doesn't break so easily, and it's a great starter. It is used in studios for snare drums, quite frequently. If you're looking for something more advanced, I'd go for a condenser microphone. They pick up much more detailed noises and sort of a lot of things that go in the room. The other microphone that I mentioned only sort of like picks up what's like right in front of it. They're a little bit more expensive. The guide for these microphones is probably the more expensive it is, the more powerful it is. Karen, the woman, asks, what is your take on the use of reverb on vocals? Well, there's no real rules for this stuff at all. With everything in music, with every decision, you should really ask yourself, what does this track need and what's the right thing for it? You should try out different things, in my opinion. There is a tendency of, because the reverb is quite nice for vocalists, because it just gives your vocals a space to kind of sit in. That being said, you should be quite curious with your decisions about reverb, because you can create some really interesting effects and make your vocals sound very unique. But if you just go for sort of like the standard reverb that everyone uses, just because you think your vocals need reverb, I don't think that's maybe the wisest of decisions. Well, thank you for all your questions. They were very interesting. If you'd like to watch more, just click on the description below. Thanks for watching.